In the spring of 1941, a German naval officer named Hans Meckel sat in a cramped room aboard a captured British trawler in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. He was part of a boarding party that had just seized the vessel, and as he rifled through the ship's communication room, he found something that made his blood run cold. Among the standard British naval codebooks and ciphers was a collection of documents that suggested the British were reading German Enigma transmissions. Meckel quickly gathered everything he could find and sent an urgent report back to Berlin. The response he received was shocking in its dismissal. German naval intelligence reviewed his findings and concluded that it was impossible. The Enigma machine was unbreakable. The British must have obtained this information through spies or lucky guesswork, not through actual decryption. This wasn't the first warning that German communications were compromised, and it wouldn't be the last. Throughout World War II, mounting evidence suggested that the Allies were reading German encrypted messages. Time and again, German ships were ambushed exactly where they planned to be. Allied convoys seemed to know exactly where U-boat patrol lines were positioned and would route around them. Military operations that should have achieved surprise were met with prepared defenses. Yet German leadership, including Hitler himself, refused to believe that their encryption system could be broken. This denial would prove to be one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures in military history. To understand why the Germans were so confident, you need to understand what the Enigma machine was. Developed in the 1920s and adopted by the German military in various forms throughout the 1930s, Enigma was an electromechanical cipher device that looked like a typewriter in a wooden box. When you pressed a key, an electrical current would pass through a series of rotating wheels called rotors, then through a plug board that could swap letters, and finally light up a different letter on a display panel. The genius of Enigma was that the rotors would advance with each key press, meaning the same letter would encrypt different letters throughout a message. The mathematical complexity was staggering. A standard military Enigma machine had 3 rotors selected from a set of 5. Each rotor could start in any 26 positions, and the plug board could swap 10 pairs of letters. When you calculated all the possible combinations, there were over 150 quintillion possible settings. To put that in perspective, if you tried one setting every second, it would take longer than the age of the universe to try them all. German cryptographers were absolutely certain that even if the Allies captured an Enigma machine, they would never be able to decrypt messages without knowing the daily settings. And those settings changed every single day at midnight.
What the Germans didn't know was that British intelligence, operating out of a Victorian mansion called Bletchley Park, about 50 miles north of London, had been reading Enigma traffic since 1940. The breakthrough had come from multiple sources. Polish mathematicians had been working on Enigma since the 1930s and had developed theoretical methods for attacking it. When Poland fell in 1939, they shared their research with the British. At Bletchley Park, a team, including mathematician Alan Turing, developed machines called bombs that could test thousands of settings per hour, looking for contradictions and patterns. They exploited German operational procedures, predictable message formats, and human errors. By 1941, they were regularly reading German naval Enigma, and by 1942, they were reading messages from all branches of the German military. The intelligence gained from these decrypts, codenamed Ultra, was extraordinary. The British could read orders from Hitler to his field commanders. They knew where U-boat patrol lines were positioned in the Atlantic. They had advance warning of German air raids. During the North Africa campaign, they could read Rommel's supply situation and troop dispositions. Before major operations, they could see German planning unfold in real time. Winston Churchill later said that Ultra shortened the war by at least 2 years and possibly saved Britain from defeat in 1941. But here's the critical part. The British knew they had to be extremely careful about how they used this information. If they acted on every decrypt, the Germans would realize their codes were broken and would change their entire encryption system. So British intelligence developed elaborate procedures for disguising the source of their knowledge. Before acting on ultra-intelligence, they would send reconnaissance aircraft over the target area so they could claim the information came from aerial observation. They would sometimes allow German operations to succeed even when they had advance warning, if stopping them would be too obvious. They created fake spy networks and false intelligence sources to explain how they knew things. The deception was so thorough that the Germans never seriously considered that Enigma itself was compromised.
American intelligence became involved in 1941, even before the United States officially entered the war. In early 1941, the U.S. Navy had been working on Japanese codes but had limited success with German systems. The British, initially reluctant to share their most precious secret, eventually agreed to exchange information with the Americans. By 1942, American cryptanalysts were working alongside their British counterparts, and American-built bombs were being constructed to handle the increasing volume of intersects. The question that haunts historians is, did Hitler ever find out? The answer is complicated and disturbing. Hitler was repeatedly warned that German communications might be compromised, but he never accepted that Enigma itself was broken. His response to these warnings reveals both his character and the institutional dysfunction of Nazi Germany. The first serious warning came in May 1941 from Admiral Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet. Dönitz had noticed a disturbing pattern. British convoys were consistently routing around his U-boat patrol lines. Ships that should have sailed into ambushes were taking unexplained detours. When U-boats did find convoys, British escorts often seemed to be expecting them. Dönitz's staff conducted an analysis and concluded that either there was a massive spy network reporting U-boat positions, or the British had developed some kind of advanced direction-finding technology, or the British were reading German codes. Dönitz reported his concerns up the chain of command. The response was a formal investigation by German naval intelligence and the organization responsible for communication security. They examined the Enigma system and concluded it was secure. They decided the British must be using advanced radar and direction-finding equipment to locate U-boats. Some information might be coming from spies or from careless radio discipline, but Enigma itself was not compromised. This conclusion was exactly what the German High Command wanted to hear, so they accepted it without further investigation. Hitler was briefed on Dönitz's concerns and the investigation's conclusions. His response was telling. He didn't question the investigation or demand further analysis. Instead, he used it as an opportunity to blame the Kriegsmarine for insufficient aggression. If British convoys were escaping, it was because U-boat commanders weren't pressing their attacks hard enough. This pattern would repeat throughout the war. Whenever evidence emerged that suggested compromised communications, Hitler would either dismiss it entirely or blame it on human failure rather than systemic problems.
Another warning came in 1943 from a Wehrmacht signals intelligence unit that had been monitoring Allied radio traffic. They noticed that Allied forces sometimes seemed to respond to German orders before those orders could reasonably have been transmitted to frontline units through normal channels. The unit prepared a detailed report suggesting that the Allies might have access to high-level German communications. The report was forwarded through channels and eventually reached Hitler's headquarters. Hitler's response was explosive. He accused the signals intelligence unit of defeatism and spreading panic. He ranted that they were looking for excuses for German military failures instead of focusing on fighting harder. The officer who had prepared the report was reassigned to a combat unit on the Eastern Front. The message was clear. Suggesting that German communications were compromised was not a career-enhancing move. What makes this particularly significant is that Hitler had access to German signals intelligence successes, and this should have made him more aware of the possibilities. German cryptanalysts had broken various Allied codes throughout the war. They had read British naval codes in 1940 and 1941 before the British changed their systems. They had limited success against American codes. Hitler received intelligence derived from these sources and valued it highly. Yet somehow, he couldn't make the logical connection that if Germany could break Allied codes, the Allies might be able to break German codes. This cognitive dissonance was partly psychological and partly institutional. Psychologically, Hitler had an inflated view of German technical superiority. In his worldview, Germans were innovators and creators, while the Allies, particularly the Americans and Soviets, were inferior peoples who could only copy and crudely imitate German achievements. The idea that British mathematicians working in a country house could outsmart German engineers and cryptographers was emotionally unacceptable to him.
Institutionally, Nazi Germany's command structure made it nearly impossible for bad news to reach Hitler in a form he would accept. By 1943, Hitler was surrounded by yes-men and officials who had learned that disagreeing with him was dangerous. Officers who brought unwelcome information were accused of defeatism, relieved of command, or worse. This created a system where information was filtered and shaped to match Hitler's existing beliefs. Intelligence that suggested Enigma was compromised was exactly the kind of information that would be suppressed or minimized before it reached Hitler. There's also evidence that some German officials suspected the truth but were afraid to act on it. General Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Armed Forces High Command, received multiple reports throughout 1943 and 1944 suggesting communication security problems. Some of these reports explicitly mentioned the possibility of Enigma being broken. Keitel did nothing with these reports, except file them away. After the war, he claimed he didn't believe the reports were credible, but some historians suspect he simply didn't want to be the one to tell Hitler that Germany's most trusted communication system was compromised. The closest Hitler came to learning the truth was probably in late 1944. By this point, the war was clearly lost. Allied forces were advancing from both east and west. Germany's intelligence services were in chaos. Some documents suggest that SS intelligence chief Walter Schellenberg prepared a comprehensive report on Allied intelligence capabilities that included the assessment that Enigma had been broken. Whether this report ever reached Hitler is unclear. Schellenberg survived the war and claimed he had tried to warn Hitler, but there's no independent confirmation of this. What we do know is that Hitler never ordered a change to the Enigma system based on security concerns. The German military continued using Enigma right up until the surrender in May 1945. Even in the final weeks, when Hitler was in the Berlin bunker issuing orders to phantom armies, those orders were being encrypted with Enigma and immediately read by the Allies. The full extent of the intelligence disaster only became clear after the war. When Allied intelligence officers began interrogating captured German commanders and reviewing captured documents, they were stunned by how much the Germans didn't know. Senior German officers were shocked when they learned that the Allies had been reading their communications. Admiral Dönitz, who had warned about security problems back in 1941, was devastated when he learned that his U-boats had been fighting against an enemy who could read his every order. General Alfred Jodl, chief of operations at the Armed Forces High Command, reportedly went pale when informed about Ultra during his interrogation.
Some German officers initially refused to believe it. They insisted it was Allied propaganda, that it was impossible, that the mathematics didn't allow for it. They had to be shown their own encrypted messages alongside the British decrypts before they would accept the truth. The psychological impact of learning that you had spent years making decisions while your enemy read your mail was profound. For Hitler specifically, the question of what he knew and when he knew it is complicated by the fact that he's not around to answer. We have no direct testimony from Hitler about his awareness of Allied codebreaking. What we have are reports of his reactions to warnings, which were consistently dismissive, and the fact that he never ordered systemic changes to German communication security, even when the evidence was overwhelming. Some historians argue that Hitler knew, at least by late 1944, but chose to do nothing because changing the system at that point would require admitting the Allies had been reading German messages for years. This would mean admitting that countless military disasters had been partly caused by compromised communications. For Hitler, who never admitted mistakes and always blamed defeats on subordinates, this would have been psychologically impossible.
Other historians argue that Hitler genuinely never understood the extent of the compromise. He was not technically minded. He had no background in mathematics or cryptography. When told that Enigma was mathematically unbreakable, he accepted it as fact because it fit his worldview of German technical superiority. The warnings he received were sufficiently ambiguous or hedged that he could dismiss them as speculation rather than proven facts. What seems most likely, based on the available evidence, is that Hitler received multiple warnings that should have led to a serious investigation of communications security, but he refused to pursue those warnings because accepting them would require accepting that Germany had been outmatched intellectually by people he considered inferior. It's another example of how Hitler's ideological beliefs and psychological limitations led him to dismiss evidence that contradicted what he wanted to believe. The consequences were catastrophic. The historian John Keegan estimated that ultra-intelligence saved hundreds of thousands of Allied lives and shortened the war significantly. In the Battle of the Atlantic, the ability to route convoys around U-boat patrol lines meant that supply lines to Britain remained open. In North Africa, knowledge of Rommel's supply situation and tactical plans gave the British crucial advantages. Before D-Day, ultra-intelligence helped the Allies understand German defensive preparations and convinced them that their deception plans were working.
Perhaps most significantly, Ultra gave Allied commanders a level of strategic insight that was unprecedented in military history. They could watch German decision-making unfold in real time. They could see disagreements between Hitler and his generals. They could identify which units were being moved where and why. They could read assessments of German strength that were more accurate than German propaganda. This didn't make Allied victory inevitable. They still had to win battles on the ground, but it gave them an enormous advantage. In the end, Hitler's refusal to accept that Enigma was compromised was entirely in character. Throughout the war, he demonstrated a pattern of rejecting information that contradicted his beliefs. He dismissed intelligence about Soviet industrial capacity before Operation Barbarossa. He refused to believe reports about Allied strength before D-Day. He insisted Germany could win even when the country was being invaded from both directions. His handling of the Enigma security question fits this pattern perfectly. He was told the truth multiple times by people in a position to know, and he rejected it every time. Because accepting it would require admitting that Germans were not superior to everyone else, that his enemies were capable of extraordinary intellectual achievements, and that some of Germany's defeats were attributable to factors beyond his control. So, when did Hitler find out that America and Britain were reading his messages? The evidence suggests he was warned repeatedly, starting in 1941, but he never truly accepted it or acted on it. He had opportunities to learn the truth, people trying to tell him the truth, and evidence pointing to the truth. But the truth was incompatible with how he saw himself and the world, so he simply refused to believe it. And that refusal, that inability to accept an uncomfortable reality, cost Germany dearly in a war they were already losing.